for more on the summit, we are joined by Prof Braun. He's a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. Professor Braun, we understand the leaders are aiming to project unity against challenges from China and Russia. But divisions within the G7 appear to be most notable when it comes to Beijing. What do you see as the biggest points of tension, and how do you expect a balancing act to play out?
This is a tremendous opportunity at the summit, but also a great need indeed to show unity, because there are geopolitical threats that the G7 have to deal with. The G7 collectively, as we know, represent the 7 largest economies of democratic states. Together, they have unparalleled economic resources and tremendous military capacity, but it has to be mobilized. It can only be mobilized through unity. And as you noted, there isn't always unity. For instance, during the more recent trip that the French president Emmanuel Macron took to Beijing, he indicated that France was trying to pursue a policy towards China that was different from that of the United States. There would be more of an independent Europe. He had to retract that, but the damage had been done. So in a sense, they have to make sure that they get the script right. And more than just getting the script right, that the declaratory statements are all in tune with the larger goals, the shared values, they also need to move along policy implementation. And that is an enormously difficult task.
Well, if there are some divisions over how to handle Beijing, the G7 are more unified when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is now well into its second year. Prime Minister Kishida has been unwavering on this as well. Now, Professor, your thoughts on Prime Minister Kishida and his sort of push to unite the G7, or as it's already united when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
They are relatively united. In terms of promises, they are saying basically the same things. President Zelensky had visited key countries in Europe, and even in the case of France, France basically has come around to saying that they want to see a Ukrainian victory, that they want to make sure that the Russian aggression is defeated, that the deterrence is restored. But it is a recognition that what happens in the case of Ukraine is not some isolated European incident, but rather it is something that is part of a global development. And that if Russia would prevail in the case of this aggression in Ukraine, then it may embolden China, which has become increasingly assertive and militarily more powerful in Southeast Asia. So China is always the elephant in the room, and any message towards Ukraine is not exclusively directed against Russia, but clearly the immediate focus is on Russia. The sanctions have not delivered as much as it was hoped for, and there is concern that among those countries and companies that are helping Russia evade what have been the most elaborate counter-sanctions are corporations and governments in various other parts of the world, particularly China or even India.
And Professor, speaking of Russia, reports are saying that a strong condemnation from the G7, also in new sanctions, could come out from this summit. How effective would they be in further squeezing Russia's economy and also deter its aggressive actions?
Sanctions alone will not do it. And any hope that the president of the United States may have had, and you may recall that he was extremely optimistic at the beginning. He had said there are sanctions coming down the pipeline that are unprecedented, and Russia does not understand just how horrific the damage will be. That has not yet materialized. It's possible that in the long term, sanctions will further erode what is a very poor economy. I mean, Russia is not an economic superpower, and Russia has a very unidimensional economy, and it takes time. But there has clearly been evasion of sanctions, and the Russians have been very clever at that, and Central Asian republics have helped them. The sanctions involve not only not purchasing Russian goods, the Europeans have tried to wean themselves away from dependence on Russian energy, but it is on an attempt to deny Russia crucial imports, the imports of sophisticated computer chips, for example. So the Russians have tried to look for creative ways. There has been, for instance, a huge surge in the sale of washing machines and toasters and even hair dryers to Central Asian republics. And these countries then are sending these over to Russia because the Russians then extract these chips and use them for military purposes. So there is this elaborate game where the West tries to be ever more creative and dedicated in applying sanctions, and where the Russians and other countries are getting more creative at trying to evade them. And this is why ultimately what is most important is what happens militarily. The sad fact of life is that as important as soft power has proven to be and continues to be, hard power cannot be neglected. And the West all too often has not paid enough attention to hard power, that is military power, which is costly, which is risky, but in a geopolitical situation where there is this kind of brazen aggression, where Russia can level nuclear threats, there is no choice but to enhance democratic hard power.
If we move away from Russia, there are domestic economic concerns hanging over Washington. Biden has said he would be needed back at home right after the G7, and we understand that the Quad meeting could now be hastily arranged in Hiroshima. What do you make of the domestic concerns in the U.S. and the impact it might have on the U.S. and its allies?
As it has been said repeatedly by various theorists and politicians, foreign policy starts at home. So if you are going to be powerful abroad, you need to be strong at home. And clearly the crisis over the potential debt ceiling, the need to resolve that between the Republicans and the Democrats is a crucial one. And the United States cannot afford to default. It sends the wrong kind of message. And this is why the Biden administration has left this a little bit late. They need to move on that very quickly. They need to find a compromise solution so they can focus on those foreign policy issues that are really pressing internationally and not allow domestic factors to overwhelm the ability of the largest democratic country, not to overwhelm their ability to act in an effective way internationally.
And Professor, given the historical significance of Hiroshima and in light of nuclear threats by Russia, China, and North Korea, what sort of strategies can the G7 employ to prevent nuclear weapons proliferation and ensure effective monitoring of nuclear arsenals?
Hiroshima is a very powerful symbol. This is where we saw first the utter destruction that can be caused by nuclear weapons, which should have taught the world that nuclear wars cannot be won and should never be fought. And the hope, of course, initially was that countries would give up nuclear weapons. That did not materialize. Then it was hoped that at the very least, countries would stop vertical as well as horizontal nuclear proliferation. That has not occurred. And we see various countries having acquired nuclear weapons, including North Korea, which has fairly unstable leadership. And we see a fanatical theocracy in the case of Iran that is rushing to try to get nuclear weapons. So there has to be nuclear deterrence. And so the unified message here to Russia in particular is do not use nuclear threats. And I think, ironically, on this, China is on the same page because China does not want to see nuclear threats. They do not want to see other countries stampeded into getting nuclear weapons, certainly not Japan and not South Korea. So China also has an interest to try to deter Vladimir Putin from continuing to make the kind of nuclear threats that he made, subtle or not, where he had hoped, that is Vladimir Putin, that somehow he could intimidate Ukraine into surrendering, or United States and the Western allies could be deterred from helping Ukraine. It has not happened, and Hiroshima ought to be an example that nuclear weapons ought never to be used, and the threat of nuclear weapons is not an appropriate way to conduct international diplomacy.
Professor, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you very much for your time and your insight this morning. We've been speaking with Aurel Braun, Professor of International Relations and Political Science at the University of Toronto.